Cimoooooooo! What's going on, guys? It's Cimo, and welcome back to my series where I bring to you guys some of the greatest minds in Yu-Gi-Oh! To discuss a myriad of different subjects ranging from card theory, the metagame, and everything else in between. So for this second episode, I am more than happy to have my next guest on, Mr. Joshua Oosters from the Netherlands. Joshua, how are you doing today?
Hey man, I'm pretty good. Even better
Good.
now that you pronounce my last name like pretty correctly. That's nice. Nice touch.
I had to I practiced it like 10 times before we started
Obviously,
this. So.
yeah.
So first of all, for those of you who don't know, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and maybe talk about some of your accomplishments.
Sure. So I'm Joshua Oosters. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a player for Team Complexity Card Gaming. As for my accomplishments, let's see. I've like a couple YCS stops, a couple Euro stops. I've won nationals, like the European equivalent, not the actual USA version, twice.
Right.
And for a lot of those things I mentioned, I played decks that people would not necessarily say are like the best deck in the room or whatever.
Far from it in some instances, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so that's going to be the subject of our discussion today. We're going to be talking about rogue decks at a competitive level, and I figured that you would be one of the best, if not the best person to talk to about this, because you've seen probably more success than anyone in this field, and I thought picking your brain about this would be wonderful. So let's talk about some of these decks that you're notorious for piloting specifically. So what would you feel like are like your either favorite decks that you've taken like really far, or some of like the most like notable decks you've played?
I would say for sure Burning Abyss is one of them in like the non-Burning Abyss formats. I mean, like not in 2015 when it was basically like the best deck, but in 2000.
Sure.
When did I play it? Like end of 2018, start of 2019. Then actually this year I got second at the regional playing it at like the first weekend of January or something. I've been playing some variants of the Musketeer deck. Sadly I didn't top a YCS with it. I went like 9-2 and then, not top because of the attendance and stuff.
Yeah, you bubbled London, and like you should have topped, but there was too many people, and it was unfortunate. But you could have been that lone musket going the whole way.
Exactly. What else is there? People might not know this, but like in 2016, I won nationals with the Cosmo Demise deck. I know you might say, but Josh, that is a meta deck. And sure, it ended up being a meta deck, but like I was the first European player who piloted the deck. It was like the same weekend. I think Fraser Smith played it in the States. I'm not sure. Like he topped the YCS with it. I played Infernoid for like forever. For some reason, I topped like.
And Infernoid variants. You played like Infernoid Sky Striker at one point.
Yeah, I played for like during the LLDS season, which is like sort of the equivalent of the UDS you have in the States. I played Sky Striker Infernoid. I think I won an LLDS with that. I'm not completely sure.
Just a man of many talents.
Yeah, sure. Let's put it like that.
So let's, now that we have an idea of some of the decks that you've played, I want to kind of break it down a little bit further. So when you're planning on entering some of these larger events, so let's say like maybe like YCS level or above, or, nationals, kind of like those higher tier level events, what is your mentality going into it that makes you decide you want to play a rogue deck versus playing a meta deck? Because you do also play meta decks at times as well, but obviously you're more known for playing the rogue stuff. So what's your thought process behind making that decision?
So this might not sound super competitive, but one of the most important things in picking a deck for any event basically is just like I want to enjoy playing the deck, right? In the end, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just something fun and I want to get the maximum amount of enjoyment out of it. And oftentimes that will be playing like something like Mermail, which I didn't talk about yet, but which was like one of the decks in the Paleo format. I played the Toad Turbo deck, which I really enjoyed. I won like a regional with that. I top 4'd another regional with that. It's basically just like I look at the deck and I'll think, will people be prepared for this? Because there's so many games you can just win because people have no clue what you're trying to accomplish, right? Then like, is it consistent enough? Maybe people just didn't look into it enough yet to know the deck's actually good. And sometimes like there is just, in my eyes, no other option. I just play like Sky Striker or whatever, because there's just formats where you can't play a rogue deck and do right. Like there have to be so many criteria it has to meet for it to be actually viable to play at an event.
Breaking that down a little bit further, you mentioned that there's criteria that you want to meet for playing that deck at an event. And I think that's probably one of the biggest keys for anyone who's watching this video who wants to play like rogue decks, who doesn't really like playing the meta decks, which is perfectly fine. But there's a lot more to it than just deciding, oh, I want to play this deck just to play it. Obviously, having fun is important, and you mentioned that, but you did mention there are those specific criteria. What is like your checklist that you look for like, I need to hit these points and then I feel confident playing this deck?
Yeah, so probably the most important one is there will be certain cards in the format which people are playing solely because they counter the meta decks, right? Like, let's say we're in a combo format, everybody's playing Nibiru. Then one of the things you don't want to be doing is playing some rogue combo deck that loses to Nibiru, because there's just no point. Why bother playing a deck like that when you're gonna get hit with it like every game? Then another one is just like, what's the deck doing, right? Does it have inherent cards to the archetype which are good against the meta decks? If we're looking at Musket, for example, Musket has like the in-deck Soul Release, right? The Dancing Needle, which banishes 3 cards from the graveyard. And like, if we're in a format where like Grave Reliant decks are really popular, then Musket might be a good deck because it has this insane card, right? And then I think I already mentioned it, but like, the deck has to be some kind of good, right? You can just take your random Blackwing deck. No offense to any Blackwing players out there, that's a perfectly fine deck to play. I'm sure it can do stuff, but like, you can just expect to take your Blackwing deck, which has no particular advantage against meta decks, and just be successful with it.
I mean, they do have a towers. You got to give them some credit.
I mean, yeah, I think Blackwing can probably do the Hulky Fireback combo right now, so, you know, it might be good. Who knows?
Yeah. But then if you go down that line of thinking, you could think about other decks that could also play the same combo that,
exactly,
aren't Blackwing.
But that's the thing, right? Like, the Blackwing deck might be able to make Hulky Firebacks and incorporate that in the deck, but there's probably some deck, like the Synchron Eldritch deck, which does it way better. So at that point, like, why would you bother playing the Blackwing deck?
Can you think of any specific examples from the decks that you have played before where, like, you knew that, like, this was going to just counteract, like, everything that people were playing?
Yeah, so basically the Musket deck, which I already mentioned, because of the Dancing Needle, the format was like Sky Striker, Dancing Needle is insane, Salamangreat, Dancing Needle is insane, Orcust, Dancing Needle is insane, and then the BA deck, which I played, which I actually started playing because Thunder Dragon just entered the format, so there was like Mistake on legs, and BA doesn't really care about that, right? I mean, sure, you have Skarm, but you can do without Skarm, that's fine. And for the Thunder Dragon deck, it was just impossible to out Beatrice without getting out the purple Dante, and then it was impossible to out the purple Dante, etc. While it was also really good against Sky Striker, was popular back then. People always said like Alter Guys was super good against BA, but actually it wasn't that bad. Like, I think I won almost all my Alter Guys matchups I played during those YCSs. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, like, people think like, oh, they have like a bounce, so it's good against Burning Abyss, but it's worth it to just like actually look into the matchup more, right? And see if it's really that bad, and even if it is that bad, how many people are playing Altergeist.
I do think you made a really good point, though, that whatever rogue deck you decide to play, you want to have the core strength of that deck versus the other decks be part of the engine.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned Dancing Needle, right? Being able to not only have Dancing Needle is good, but the fact that you can search it like, 9 different ways is also matters, because if you can't see the card or the cards that make your deck good, right, it doesn't matter. So I think you made a really good point there. Also, same thing with like BA versus Thunder. BA, you don't care about Colossus, right? Yeah. But B, you also can get to Beatrice just through pretty much any 2 BA monsters, and that effectively is your win condition. And since you're playing like, anywhere from like 12, ish BAs, maybe a little bit less, more depending on the build, then, that's perfectly okay.
Yeah.
So the next thing I wanted to ask you was, what do you feel is the biggest mistake that players make when they're wanting to pick a rogue deck to play for an event? because obviously there's tons of people. You look at like the full meta breakdowns of tournaments, and yes, while there's tons of whatever the top decks are, majority of those decks of people competing in YCSs are actually rogue decks or decks that like no one would even conceivably think of playing. And then once you get down to the latter stages of the tournament, that's when you start to hone the meta and you start to see more of like what the best decks are. So what do you feel like are the biggest mistakes that players make thinking of taking a deck like this into an event?
I think probably like there's two things which are the most important in my opinion. Like one of them is people who are playing certain decks, they will be really like set in their strategy, right? They are really like, oh, I want to play this deck, but I don't want to include X amount of discards or like this engine because like then the deck's not pure anymore, which is something you see on like the Facebook groups so much.
Yeah.
And you're just hindering your deck building, right? And the other thing is, it's really important to know when to stop playing a certain rogue deck, because it's not good anymore. That basically comes back to the thing I mentioned earlier, where like if Nibiru gets really popular, you might not want to be playing the Burning Abyss Block Dragon deck, for example. And people just fail to realize like how the format changes and which cards become more popular, etc. And they just keep playing the deck they were playing, even though it became much less viable because of certain trends that started popping up. I think you can probably still play decks like that if there's like some way to counter build against the cards that are more popular. But a lot of people they are just not keeping up with the formats, which is probably even more important when you're playing a rogue deck compared to playing a meta deck which has like a super powerful engine like Adamantivator, for example. I mean, people can be playing Dark Wheeler the War, Nibiru, whatever. Adamantivator is still probably the best deck, right? And your Blackwing deck probably, can't really compare to the, again, Blackwing, super cool deck, but I'm just using it like a token rogue deck, right?
Blackwing players are gonna hate us after this video, but that's okay. So
it's okay. Like,
I understand why they're kind of like just like the lightning rod of like rogue players. I can understand why that's like the default, but that's okay. I want to kind of break down what you were talking about a little bit more. So the first point that you mentioned was in regards to not limiting yourself in deck building, and I also do believe that this is a area where a lot of people falter, because just because you're not playing so many different, take Rafael Nevin, for example, when he played like Luna Light, right?
Yeah.
And like Danger Luna Light was a thing. A lot of people gave him flack because it wasn't like this pure Luna Light deck.
Yeah.
But at its heart, it's still Luna Light, and why would you limit the deck's potential solely due to the fact that it's not a pure deck? That deck was incredibly powerful, one of the most powerful decks we've had of the past year before Tiger got hit. And tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is probably like the best example you could have taken. Like, when I was watching like his deck profile or something, there were so many comments where like, oh, this is not a Luna Light deck because it includes danger cards. Like, okay, so apparently he can't make his deck better because then he has to play like these other cards which don't include Luna Light in the name. It's literally something I can't grasp my head around.
It illustrates a point that it's almost like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Because if you don't play those cards, then your deck isn't considered like truly rogue. But then if you do, and it's like a no-win situation essentially.
For sure.
But the thing is, when it comes to that specifically, before Raph won that tournament, Luna Light was virtually off the radar, right? Maybe a couple people were talking about it, but besides that, no one was even considering that this deck was viable. Sure. And so this is where the innovation of the game really stands out, because no one knew what the Luna Light cards did. No one realized that they were broken. No one realized Chick sent for cost. No one realized Tiger could be abused in the way that it could.
Yep.
And then that's how we get to the point where we're able to create these new and powerful decks and actually drive some innovation in the game. And so, I don't know, it's a little bit... It's a little bit conflicting at times, like seeing how the community reacts to something like this, because it's this truly rogue deck, but then the definition of rogue is a little bit subjective from person to person.
You can play a rogue deck, and then the rogue deck people will still be mad at you because you're not following like their guidelines or something. I have like another, it's not exactly the same, but it's really hard, right? Because some people will really like basically fanboy over people playing a certain deck or whatever. I had like I topped YCS again with Sky Striker, right, which isn't exactly a very interesting or innovative or whatever deck. And I had people commenting who were like mad because I played the deck. Like, oh, why is this guy playing this deck? He should be playing Burning Abyss. Sure, I could be playing Burning Abyss, but I wouldn't be, winning more than 50% of my matches. So,
sure, like,
it's really interesting just looking at basically the community and how they're looking at certain things. Sometimes it's really hard to understand.
But I think that plays into your second point, though, about knowing when to quit on a rogue deck. Not necessarily quit, but maybe, let's say, put aside, at least for a given tournament. Yeah. Because as someone who plays these types of decks, when one of those decks might be viable or not. And so you consciously make that decision that, okay, for this event, I'm actually going to play something a bit more meta, because I don't feel any of these rogue decks that A, I'd like to play, but B, might be viable, are good enough to be able to see that amount of success that you want to see.
Yeah. There's like a bit of an issue with that, to be honest, because one of the things I think is really important when you're playing a rogue deck is you have to like basically keep playing the deck, right? Because it's so important to know, A, if it's still viable, or B, if it's not anymore, can you still adjust it in some way so it is still viable? So there goes like a lot of testing and hours into it. And then sometimes a week before the YCS, there will be like some deck or some innovation or whatever which makes the rogue deck obsolete. And then you're basically stuck with all this time you spent testing this rogue deck, but you don't have the necessary time anymore to pick a different deck or just go to a meta deck. I don't really have an answer to this. I just want to like point it out. This is one of the issues you have when you're playing when you're sticking to one of these strategies, but it is something to keep in your mind when you're deciding to go this specific route of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that sunk cost fallacy where people might feel that they've committed 20, 30, 40 hours of testing into a specific rogue deck, but then even if the deck isn't performing as well as they might have liked, they still want to play it because they felt the investment is there, and so they feel like that's the direction they need to take. And so I think you are very good at being able to pivot, knowing when to cut your losses and when to pivot to something else, because that can just make or break how well you do in a tournament, because it doesn't matter if you spend 100 hours, trying to play a deck and perfect it, but if there's like a new set that gets released or a new strategy that gets developed that makes your deck completely obsolete, like you mentioned, then you pretty much just spent all that time for nothing. You could have spent even a fraction of that time deviating your idea to something else and just honing a different idea to help you see a bit more success.
Exactly. You could have spent like 50 hours testing your Gladiator Beast strategy, but then with 2 hours playing Orcus, you might just do better, right? So
right, you're gonna make the Gladiator Beast players hate you now too. First the Blackwing.
I just want to point out, I absolutely love the Gladiator Beast. It was the first deck I ever played. I just wanted to make the Blackwing players less upset, basically.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. You gotta encompass everyone.
Yeah.
But no, I think that also highlights another point too, before we wrap things up here, that when you're playing one of these rogue decks, you still have to consider the fact that your deck is inherently at a disadvantage compared to the top decks. The top decks are the top decks for a very specific reason. It's because they're either more consistent than your deck, they have a higher ceiling than your deck, they have better recursion than your deck. They just do things better than your deck naturally should be able to do. And so going back to the first point you were saying, you need to find the unfair things that your deck can do. Whether the other decks can do it or not is up for debate, but specifically focusing on what your deck can do, because if you can just take that to the fullest advantage, that's how you're going to get to see the most success. Like, again, like you mentioned with like Magical Musket, with Dancing Needle, being able to just abuse that as much as possible, or for instance with like the Lunalight, like we were talking about earlier, just incorporating the dangers, because you get to abuse the fact that you have this combo of cards that synergizes very well together.
Exactly.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you before we wrap things up is, what advice would you give to any aspiring rogue players? I know we talked about things that you feel are things that could be the biggest mistakes players make, but if you were like talking to someone, if someone came up to you asking for advice, what would be the biggest piece or just pieces of advice you would give to someone who's looking to start playing rogue decks at the competitive level?
I guess basically it will be like a little summary of what we talked about. Just don't limit yourself in the deck building. Very important. Put in the hours with the deck, because you can't just randomly take any deck that's not considered good and then perform well with it. It's so important to understand like the mechanics of the deck, what it does, what its strengths are. like even more so than for other meta decks, right? And then, you know, cut your losses. Like if the deck just isn't good, or it for some reason isn't good anymore, you just have to accept it and move on. At least if you have the time to do so in preparation. I think those are basically like the biggest three, and then just let you know, consider which decks to play. Don't just want to make a certain deck viable, because some decks, they just can't compete whatever you do with them, basically.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's good not to get tunnel vision, and rather than trying to make your deck work a certain way, let the deck do the work.
Yeah.
And you understand how that it kind of like matches up against the certain matchups. Because I feel that so many people will get stuck in like, I have to play this certain deck.
Exactly.
And it's like, if you want to, that's fine. But if you want to play it well, you have to still consider your other options. And if you're playing like, let's say Blackwing versus Gladiator Beast in any certain metagame, and you realize that Gladiator Beast is actually matching up rather well against some of these decks for whatever reason in this hypothetical situation, but you're just like, you're tunneled in on Blackwing, it makes more sense to kind of just put that aside, explore the other option, and be like, oh, this actually does something better than I thought, and that's going to be the way I want to take it. So no, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that's really good advice.
Exactly.
So Joshua, thank you so much for your time. I hope everyone really enjoyed hearing you. I'm sure they did. And definitely be sure to let me know down in the comments below, guys, if you enjoy these series. I really love to hear your thoughts. Joshua, any final thoughts before we close off here?
You know, just don't forget, Yu-Gi-Oh's all about fun. So even if fun for you is going like 0-8 in the tournament, playing your Blackwing strategy, that's perfectly fine. Right?
The comments is going to be so brutal to you. I'm just going to warn you. All right, Joshua, thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for watching the video, and we will see you next time.